She had spent 11 years perfecting the art of taking up no space. Not in the physical sense. That particular battle she had long since conceded to the reality of her body, but in every other sense that mattered in the world she moved through daily, the sense of presence, of notice, of existing in a room in any way that invited attention. Celestine Avery wore her invisibility like a second skin, and she had tailored it with the same meticulous care she brought to everything else in her life, which was to say considerably more care than anyone around her ever realized, because that was precisely the point. You did not notice the care. You did not notice her. That was the architecture of it, and it had held for 11 years without a crack. She was 32 years old, and she carried 250 pounds on a body that her mother had described, in the particular vocabulary of women who had absorbed their own damage and passed it along as wisdom, as a lot of woman, which Celestine had understood from approximately age 9 to mean too much of one. Though her mother had always deployed the phrase with a kind of helpless love that made the wound more complicated than it would have been if delivered cleanly. She had dark brown skin and black hair that she kept pulled back in a severe bun at the nape of her neck, not because the style suited her. She knew, in the abstract, that it did not, that the loose curls she occasionally permitted herself on Sunday mornings changed her face into something entirely different, something warmer and more open, but because the bun was efficient and demanded nothing from anyone, including her. She had large, dark eyes with the specific quality of attention that came from spending most of your life watching rather than being watched, and a mouth that was, in an accounting she never performed herself, genuinely beautiful, full and precisely shaped, though she had not worn lipstick since a coworker had told her, with the cheerful cruelty of someone delivering a compliment, that it was brave of her to draw attention to her face, given everything else going on. She worked as a personal stylist assistant at Marchetti Couture, which was perhaps the single most ironic employment situation a woman committed to her own invisibility could have arranged for herself, in which she had arrived at not through any particular passion for fashion, but through the kind of practical necessity that shapes more careers than ambition ever does. She was good at her job, which consisted primarily of making other people look extraordinary while effacing herself so thoroughly in the process that clients rarely remembered she had been in the room. She had an eye that her employer, a volatile Neapolitan named Julia, called unervingly precise and sometimes deployed as a compliment and sometimes deployed as a threat, depending on Julia's current emotional temperature, which fluctuated with the reliability of weather systems. Celestine tracked the inventory, managed the appointments, handled the vendor relationships with the patient exactitude of someone who understood that the structural work of any enterprise was only ever visible when it failed, and dressed herself every single day in garments that were designed, above all other considerations, to not be noticed. The wardrobe she had assembled over 11 years was a masterwork of deliberate obscurity. Charcoal and slate and ink and oud, in fabrics that draped rather than defined, in cuts that fell from the shoulder without ever acknowledging the body beneath them. Oversized blazers worn over wide-leg trousers. Tunic-length shirts in dark linen that skimmed her hips without touching them. Cardigans that reached her knees, belted loosely so that the belt achieved the fiction of a waist without actually revealing one. She owned nothing in red, nothing in emerald or sapphire or gold, or any of the jewel tones that occasionally caught her eye in the sample racks at Marchetti, and which she sometimes touched briefly, running a thumb across a bolt of silk or velvet, before moving on to something more practical. She had convinced herself, with the thoroughness of a person who has repeated a thing until it became invisible as belief, that the muted palette was a professional choice, an aesthetic preference, a statement about restraint. The truth, which she understood on a level she had chosen not to examine, was simpler and less flattering. She dressed in colors that would not be missed if they disappeared, because she dressed for disappearance. The Genetti account arrived at Marchetti on a Tuesday morning in April, delivered in the form of a phone call that Julia took in her private office with the door shut, which Celestine noted with the automatic attention she brought to all irregularities in the household's routine, and which was followed by Julia emerging with an expression that combined professional excitement with something underneath that Celestine catalogued, correctly, as a faint, controlled unease. The Genetti family, Julia explained, required a complete formal wardrobe consultation for an event in 3 weeks. They were sending a representative to discuss requirements. The representative would arrive at 2. Celestine was to be present throughout. She was to bring the current book of evening samples and the new autumn collection that had arrived from Milan the previous Friday. The name Giannetti would have meant nothing to most people in Chicago who moved in ordinary circles. It meant something specific and considerable to anyone who paid attention to the city's private architecture of power. The Giannetti family controlled the port infrastructure along the southern lakefront with a thoroughness that was partly legitimate and partly the product of decades of arrangements that never appeared in any public filing. And the current head of the family, a man named Rocco Giannetti, had been described in the one investigative piece that a local magazine had managed to publish about him before quietly discontinuing the series as someone who understood that real power never announced itself, because it had no need to. Celestine had read the piece. She remembered it now, standing at the sample rack in the main consultation room of Marchetti's private floor, arranging bolts of silk by weight, and she told herself that the particular alertness she felt was professional caution and nothing more complicated. The representative arrived at 5 minutes before 2, which was not the representative Celestine had been expecting. She had been expecting a lieutenant, a lawyer, someone whose function was intermediary. The man who came through the consultation room's glass doors at 1:55 was not an intermediary. She understood this from the way Julia moved when he entered, the particular compression of her whole posture that happened when someone of genuine authority occupied her space. And she understood it from the way the 2 men who had entered with him positioned themselves near the walls with the automatic efficiency of people whose entire professional function was architecture, arranging themselves around their principle the way walls arrange themselves around a room. And she understood it from the man himself, from the sheer, uncompromising physicality of his presence, which was the kind that does not require introduction because the room has already responded before introductions can be offered. He was tall, well past 6 feet, and built with a density that his dark, perfectly constructed suit made no attempt to minimize. He had black hair worn close at the sides and slightly longer on top, and a face of such precisely arranged severity, jaw like something carved rather than grown, a faint scar tracing the line of his left cheekbone, dark eyes under heavy brows, that it would have been difficult to categorize as handsome in any conventional sense and impossible to look away from for reasons that had nothing to do with convention. He moved through the consultation room the way a change in pressure moves through a sealed space. Not loudly, not with any visible effort, but with the absolute certainty of something that was going to arrive at its destination regardless of whatever else occupied the terrain between here and there. Rocco Giannetti. She knew it without being told, with the particular certainty of someone who has been paying careful attention to the world for long enough to recognize its most significant features on sight. He did not look at Julia first. He looked at Celestine. She was standing at the sample rack with a bolt of burgundy silk draped over her forearm. In her slate-gray tunic and her dark wide-legged trousers, and her cardigan, her hair in its severe bun, as close to invisible as she could make herself in a room containing $12,000 fabric, and his gaze found her immediately and with a directness that felt, for the disorienting second before she could break away from it, almost physical. He looked at her the way people look at things they are identifying rather than simply seeing, with the specific focus of someone running a rapid and thorough assessment. And then, as Julia stepped forward with her practiced professional warmth and began the introductory choreography, he let Celestine go and turned his attention to the business at hand, and she allowed herself to breathe. The consultation was for a formal gala in 3 weeks. The Giannetti family was making a significant philanthropic announcement at the event and required evening wear for 5 members of the household. Julia pulled up the sample books and began the process with the smooth efficiency of someone who understood exactly who she was working with and what the parameters were, and Celestine moved through the background of it with her customary silent precision, retrieving samples when needed, logging notes on the tablet she carried, anticipating requests before they were made. She was very good at being in a room without being in a room. She had been doing it for 11 years. What she was not accustomed to was someone in the room noticing that she was doing it. He said nothing for the first 40 minutes. He sat in the consultation chair that Julia's assistant had placed for him, flanked by his 2 men who remained standing, and he tracked the consultation with the specific, contained attention of a man who had made a career of watching things more carefully than the people doing them believed he was watching. He asked 2 questions, both precise and pertinent, both answered by Julia with visible relief at their reasonableness, and then he returned to that quality of watching. And Celestine, who had developed over years an almost sonar-like sensitivity to being observed, felt his attention return to her at intervals that she registered and tried to disregard and could not quite fully disregard, because whatever quality of attention Rocco Giannetti brought to bear on a thing, it was not the kind that was easy to dismiss. The moment arrived obliquely, the way the significant moments in Celestine's experience generally did, disguised as something ordinary until it was already over and its consequences were irreversible. Julia had asked her to retrieve the autumn velvet samples from the secondary room, a task that took perhaps 4 minutes, and when she returned carrying the heavy bolt of deep sapphire velvet she had selected as the first representative piece, she found that Julia had stepped out to take a call and that the 2 security men had shifted position slightly, which meant that when she came through the door, she was crossing directly toward the consultation chair and the man seated in it with nothing in between them, and she was halfway across the room before she registered that his gaze had moved to her completely and was not moving away. She stopped. The bolts in her arms were heavy, the sapphire velvet and the emerald brocade she had brought as a second option, and she held them with the unconscious competence of someone who had been carrying heavy things in a professional capacity for a long time. And she looked back at him because the alternative was to look away, and she had learned from long experience that looking away was interpreted by certain kinds of people as an invitation to pursue whatever they'd been planning. "Mr. Giannetti," she said evenly, "Julia will be back in a moment. She asked me to bring these for the—" "Put them down," he said. His voice was a low, smoke-edged baritone that she felt in the floor under her feet as much as she heard it, and there was nothing rude in the instruction and nothing casual either. It was the tone of someone accustomed to having the things they said become immediately true in the physical world. She put the bolts on the sample table. "Come here," he said. She crossed the remaining distance because the alternative required more resistance than she currently had access to, stopped in front of him at what she judged to be a professional distance, and held herself with the composed stillness she had perfected over a decade of not being seen by people she was actively serving. He looked at her for a long moment that she withstood without speaking, because she had learned that silence was a tool, and she was not going to surrender hers first. "What's your name?" he said. "Celestine," she said. "Celestine Avery. I'm Julia's assistant." "How long?" he said. 11 years. He nodded once, slowly, the way someone nods when a piece of information has landed precisely where they expected it to. His eyes moved over her, not with the quality of the appraising look she had learned to armor herself against, the kind that found her wanting and dismissed her, but with something that more closely resembled the look she brought to the sample fabrics herself when she was trying to understand what was underneath the surface finish. Deliberate, interested, unconcerned with her opinion of being looked at. "You have an eye," he said. "Julia seems to think so," Celestine said, keeping her voice neutral. "Julia uses it," he said. "That's not the same as thinking so." He stood up, which changed the geometry of the room entirely, because standing he was considerably taller than she had registered from a distance, and the particular quality of contained, physical authority he carried became significantly more present at this proximity. He was close enough that she could smell him, cedar and dark tobacco, and underneath it something clean and cold that she had no name for, like the air before a storm settles, and she stayed where she was because moving would have been a concession, though she was very aware that staying required something. "What are you wearing?" he said. The question landed so far outside the parameters of what she had been expecting that she processed it as a non sequitur for a full second before understanding that it was exactly what it appeared to be. "My clothes," she said. "I can see that they're clothes," Rocco Giannetti said, with a patience that was somehow more unsettling than impatience would have been. "I'm asking why these ones." Celestine looked at him. She had a repertoire of responses to this specific category of observation, honed over years of comments from co-workers and clients who had, in the particular way of people who work adjacent to beauty, felt compelled to note that she might consider doing more with herself. They were all versions of deflection, all variations on the same theme of redirecting attention without confronting its source directly. She chose none of them now, because something in the quality of his question was different from all the previous iterations. It was not a critique, she realized, not a kind-phrased suggestion about improvement, not the backhanded species of concern that weaponizes its own gentleness. It was a genuine inquiry, the kind a person makes when they believe they are looking at something they do not yet fully understand and intend to. "They're practical," she said. "For what?" he said. "For working," she said. "For not being in the way." He was quiet for a moment. "In the way of what?" he said. The question was so simple and so devastating that she had no immediate answer for it. Not because she did not know the answer, but because the answer, spoken aloud in this room, in this light, to this particular man who was looking at her, as though he could see the architecture underneath the answer, felt like something she had never permitted herself to say in any room where someone might hear it. He watched her not answer, and the watching was not cruel. She had a very calibrated sense, by this point in her life, of the difference between the watching that wanted to catch her out and the watching that was simply refusing to be satisfied with the surface, and this was the second kind. And then he reached out, his large hand closing around the lapel of her cardigan, and pulled. It was a single, decisive motion. The cardigan's top 2 buttons gave with a soft sound, and the garment fell open down her front, revealing the dark tunic beneath, and she stood utterly still because the shock of it had hollowed out every prepared response she possessed. He did not touch her. He let the cardigan hang open on her shoulders and stepped back slightly, looking at what the garment had been covering, and the expression on his face was not what she had been braced for. Not predatory, not cruel, not the specific register of someone finding confirmation of something they'd suspected and wished they hadn't. It was something else entirely. It was the look of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for in a place they were not surprised to be looking. "Why are you hiding yourself?" he said. "Not you shouldn't hide yourself. Not you have nothing to hide. Why are you hiding yourself?" Which was a question about an action and its motive rather than a judgment about its necessity. And the distinction was so precise and so unexpected that she felt it land somewhere below her professional composure, in the part of her she had walled off and maintained in darkness for 11 years. "It's easier," she said, before she had decided to say it. "For who?" he said. The door opened and Julia returned, her phone still in her hand, her gaze moving quickly over the room and landing with a professional smoothness that did not entirely conceal the quality of her awareness on the specific arrangement of Celestine standing in front of Rocco Giannetti with her cardigan hanging open and his eyes on her face. Julia's expression recalibrated rapidly, the way her expressions always did. She was a woman of extraordinary professional flexibility, and she began to speak, something about the autumn collection being ready for review, but Rocco raised one hand from his side in a gesture so minimal it barely qualified as movement, and Julia stopped. "I want the stylist's appointment added to the consultation," he said. He was still looking at Celestine. "Not Julia. Her. I want Celestine to dress my household for the gala," he paused. "I want her included in the dressing." Julia's pause lasted precisely 2 seconds, which was 1.5 seconds longer than her pauses usually lasted, which told Celestine everything she needed to know about how Julia was processing this instruction. "Of course, Mr. Giannetti," Julia said. "Celestine is certainly capable of." "I'm not finished," Rocco said quietly. "I want a separate appointment. For her. Custom pieces. Tell your atelier I want an evening gown in the sapphire velvet she brought in." His eyes moved from Celestine's face to the bolt on the table and back. "And the emerald. Both. I want them ready in 2 weeks." He looked at Celestine with a directness that she had no defense prepared for. "You will wear one of them to the gala. I'm hosting a table. You'll be at it." The silence in the room was the specific quality that follows when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and which has not yet been processed by everyone present. Julia maintained her professional composure with a grace Celestine would later deeply respect. Celestine herself stood with her cardigan still hanging open on her shoulders, with the sapphire velvet bolt on the table to her left catching the room's light in the particular way that beautiful fabrics catch light when they have been chosen correctly, and she looked at Rocco Giannetti and tried to find the appropriate response in the vocabulary available to a woman who had spent 11 years not being addressed directly and who was, in this moment, being addressed with an absolute and non-negotiable directness that she had never in her adult life encountered from anyone. "I don't attend client events," she said finally, because it was the most truthful thing she could offer that was not the thing she actually meant, which was that she did not attend events where people would look at her, Because people looking at her led to the kinds of outcomes she had spent 11 years architecting against. "You do now," Rocco said, and the two words had the same quality as everything else he said. Final, certain, requiring no defense because he had never in his life said something he intended to retract. He reached past her to the sapphire velvet bolt on the table, lifted it slightly, let it fall back. "This color is yours," he said, with the same tone he might use to identify a line item in a contract. Not a compliment, not a declaration, simply an identification of fact. "I don't know who convinced you otherwise, but they were wrong, and I don't tolerate incorrect information persisting in my household." 3 days later, Celestine sat in Marchetti's private atelier on a raised fitting platform, while Julia's head seamstress, a small, precise Florentine woman named Orietta, who had been constructing garments for extraordinary bodies for 40 years and treated every other approach as a lesser art form, moved around her with measuring tape and chalk and the particular focused reverence of a person doing something they considered genuinely important. The sapphire velvet lay across the cutting table in a length that caught the atelier's north-facing light and turned it into something oceanic, deep and shifting and alive with color. Celestine sat on the platform and looked at it, and tried not to feel the specific, trembling quality of emotion she had been managing for 3 days, ever since Rocco Giannetti had stood in the consultation room and looked at her and asked, simply and without cruelty, why she was hiding herself. The question had not left her. She had carried it through the 3 intervening days the way you carry something that is heavier than it looks, feeling the weight of it in unexpected moments, standing at the coffee machine in the morning, riding the L home in the evening, lying in the dark of her apartment looking at the ceiling with the particular wakefulness of someone whose mind has decided that sleep is less important than a problem it is not going to let go of. Why are you hiding yourself? For who? She had returned to these questions with the involuntary compulsion of a tongue returning to a loose tooth, pressing the same sore place again and again, not because it felt good, but because the alternative was leaving it alone, and she had already tried that for 11 years, and it had not resolved anything. Orietta draped the first length of sapphire velvet across Celestine's shoulder and stepped back, and Celestine looked in the mirror at the opposite end of the atelier, and the woman looking back at her was not the woman she saw in the mirror at home. She could not have articulated, precisely, what was different. The velvet was not yet cut or sewn. It simply lay across her shoulder and draped down the front of her, heavy and rich and the precise shade of blue that did something specific to the brown of her skin, made it luminous in a way that the dark grays and slates of her usual wardrobe did not and could not. But that was not the difference. The difference was in the quality of the looking. Standing in her own apartment in her dark practical clothes, she looked in the mirror the way she had been taught to look, critically, with the specific eye of someone identifying problems. Standing here, with the velvet against her skin, she looked the way Rocco Giannetti had looked at her in the consultation room, with the quality of someone identifying something real, something worth identifying. Orietta said nothing. She was not a woman who narrated the obvious. She adjusted the drape, made a mark with her chalk, moved to the other side, and worked in the efficient silence of someone whose opinions were expressed entirely through the precision of what she produced. Celestine sat still and let herself be measured, which was an act so unfamiliar to her as a form of care rather than evaluation that she had to breathe through the first few minutes of it with a deliberateness that would have been embarrassing to explain to anyone. Her phone lit on the side table with a message from an unknown number, which she picked up and looked at with the habitual caution of someone who had not given her personal number to many people and was therefore suspicious of messages from those who had obtained it regardless. The message was 4 words: tomorrow, 10 o'clock. The address below, it was a building on the Gold Coast whose residential units she knew, from her general knowledge of Chicago's geography of wealth, started at 4 million and went considerably higher from there. She stared at the message for a moment, then looked up at the mirror, at the sapphire velvet and the woman wearing it, and made the decision she had been making in increments for 3 days without acknowledging that she was making it. She typed back, "What should I wear?" The response came in under 30 seconds, "Whatever you want." Then, a beat later, "Not the gray cardigan." She put her phone down and looked at the mirror again, and for the first time in a very long time, the woman looking back did not look like someone trying not to be seen. She looked like someone who had been found. The following morning arrived with the particular clarity of a Chicago spring day that has decided, temporarily, to be something gentler than the season usually allows, the light coming off the lake at an angle that turned everything it touched briefly golden. And Celestine stood in her apartment in front of her open wardrobe for 6 minutes before she reached past the dark grays and the slates and the charcoals to the single item that existed at the very back of her wardrobe on its own hanger. Wrapped in a cloth bag, preserved there for the 11 years she had owned it without ever once wearing it outside the privacy of her own rooms. It was a deep burgundy-wrapped dress in a heavy matte jersey that she had bought on a day when something in her had briefly, furiously decided that she was done hiding, and which she had brought home and hung up and never put on again, because the decision had not survived contact with the world she actually inhabited. She took it off the hanger now, unwrapped it, put it on. She looked in the mirror. She took her hair out of the bun she had already put it in and let it fall in the loose curls she permitted herself on Sunday mornings. She looked in the mirror again. She chose the heeled boots she owned and not the flat ones. She left. The building on the Gold Coast had a lobby that smelled of cut flowers and polished limestone, and the specific quality of expensive quiet that money purchases when it has been old enough for long enough. And Celestine crossed it with the full weight of her body in the heeled boots and the burgundy dress, her hair loose, taking up the space she occupied without apologizing for it, which was a new experience at 8:45 in the morning on a Tuesday, and which felt, she discovered, less terrifying than she had spent 11 years believing it would feel. The concierge called up, and she was directed to the 43rd floor, and when the elevator opened onto a private foyer and Rocco Giannetti was standing in it with his jacket off and his dark eyes moving immediately to her face, and then to the dress, and then back to her face with a quality of attention she now recognized as his particular form of confirmation, the look of someone finding a thing where they placed it. She did not cross her arms over her chest, did not reach for the non-existent hem of a cardigan. She stood in what she had worn and she looked back at him, and she said, "You were right about the gray cardigan." Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face, contained and precise, but real. "I usually am," he said. "Come in." She came in. The apartment was the kind of space that communicated wealth not through ostentation, but through the specific restraint of having chosen only things that were exactly right, a quality she recognized from her professional life, and which here, in his private space, felt deeply personal. The windows faced the lake, and the morning light came through them in the same golden angle she had noticed on her walkover, falling across the polished floors and the few carefully chosen pieces of furniture with an impartiality that made everything it touched look exactly as it was. He led her to a sitting room where coffee had already been poured, where a flat garment box lay on the low table between the two chairs, and he sat in one chair and gestured to the other, and she sat, and he looked at her for a moment in the morning light, and she let him, and the experience of being looked at with that particular quality of complete, uncritical attention was something she was beginning to understand she was going to need to build an entirely new vocabulary for. "Open the box," he said. She did. The tissue inside was heavy and layered, and when she lifted it away, the fabric beneath was the emerald silk she had brought to the consultation room 3 days ago, but cut and finished now into something that bore the relationship to the original bolt that a finished painting bears to the canvas, the material transformed by intention. It was a gown, simply structured, heavy with its own quality, cut in a way that she understood immediately, with her professional eye, was designed not to accommodate her body but to address it, to make specific and deliberate use of the full, generous dimensions of her, the sweep of her hips, the curve of her waist, the weight of her chest, as elements of a composition rather than problems to be managed around. Orietta's work. She ran her thumb along the seam at the shoulder and felt the precision of it, and felt something else underneath that, something she had been managing and was now, it seemed, going to have to simply feel. "There's a dinner on Thursday," Rocco said. "Here. 8 people. People whose opinion of what they see across my table matters, in specific ways, to specific things." His voice was even, his eyes on her face. "I want you there." She looked up from the gown. "As what?" she said. "As someone I've decided is worth placing where people can see them," he said, with a simplicity that precluded argument because it contained no performance, no flattery, No structure that required anything from her in return for the statement except to believe it. You've been deciding, for a long time, that you're worth hiding. I disagree. I find that the things I disagree with have a way of eventually resolving in my favor. You're very accustomed to getting what you want, Celestine said. Yes, he agreed, without apology or modulation. I'm offering you what I want. What I'm asking is whether you want the same thing. She looked at the emerald gown in her lap, at the precision of Orietta's seams, at the way the fabric caught the morning light, and held it. She thought about 11 years of dark cardigans. She thought about the burgundy dress hanging in the back of her wardrobe for the same 11 years, unworn, preserved like a postponed intention. She thought about standing on the fitting platform in the atelier yesterday and looking in the mirror with the sapphire velvet on her shoulder and seeing, for the first time, something other than a problem to be solved. She thought about what it would mean to let herself be placed somewhere visible, deliberately, by someone who had looked at her with full attention and found, in what he saw, not a compromise but a choice. Thursday, she said. What time? The faint almost smile moved across his face again, more certain this time, carrying something in it that she was still building the vocabulary for. 8, he said. Where the emerald? His eyes moved briefly to the burgundy dress she was wearing now, and back to her face. Or that. Either one. Both of them are yours, he paused. Everything you've been hiding is yours, Celestine. I'm simply no longer willing to watch you treat it as something else. She sat in the morning light in the apartment on the 43rd floor with the emerald gown in her lap and the coffee going warm on the table, and she made the decision that had been making itself incrementally for 3 days, and which she now understood was not actually a decision about a man or a dinner or a gown, but a decision about the 11 years she had spent in the dark cardigan, about the burgundy dress at the back of the wardrobe, about the mirror in the atelier and what she had seen. In it, about a question, why are you hiding yourself? For who? That she had been carrying since Tuesday, and which she now recognized she was not going to be able to put down. She was not going to put it down. She had been putting it down her entire adult life, setting it carefully in the dark of spaces she did not examine, and she was not going to do it anymore, not because Rocco Giannetti had told her not to, but because she had stood in front of a mirror wearing sapphire velvet and seen something that could not be unseen, and the woman in that mirror deserved Thursday dinner. She deserved the emerald gown. She deserved, in a larger accounting that she was only beginning to make, every jewel-toned, precisely tailored, fully inhabited inch of the life she had been folding up and pressing to the margins for 11 years, and she was going to stop folding it. Starting now. Celestine Avery spent 11 years perfecting her own disappearance, dressed in the colors of fog and shadow, hiding a woman the world had never been given the chance to underestimate because it had never been given the chance to see her at all. And the only thing it took to dismantle 11 years of careful, exhausting invisibility was one man who looked where everyone else had learned not to look and refused, with the quiet and absolute authority of someone who had never in his life accepted an incorrect version of reality, to pretend that what he saw was anything less than exactly what it was. If you loved watching a woman reclaim the space she always deserved, and a man who understood her worth before she was ready to claim it herself, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs the reminder that hiding yourself has never once made you safer, only smaller, and subscribe so you never miss another story about women who were underestimated until they weren't, and the men who knew better from the very beginning.